Well, welcome today to the Practical Business Owners Idea Series sponsored by Stearns Financial Group. My name is Kurt Gilner. I'm the Director of Business Owner Services at Stearns Financial Group, and I can only say that I am just amazingly excited today to have with me Abby Donnelly. And for those of you, I think in our audience who know Abby, certainly she has almost no introduction needed here, but we are going to just take just a second and talk about Abby a little bit. I've known Abby for a while now and have had opportunity to talk to folks who she has helped and see the benefit of her work and experience and knowledge in the lives of business owners in this area and elsewhere. And never have I ever not been impressed by the words that they speak. And so I am very excited to have Abby today. Abby, welcome. We are so glad to have you. I am so looking forward to this conversation. You know, you and I have had some conversation about succession and exit. And by the way, shameless plug for Abby's book, which we'll talk about more as we go along. But, you know, I have heard so much conversation and had conversation with business owners in my travels over the last 30 days. And I think I might have mentioned this statistic, but I'm going to say I've easily had 10 to 12 of these conversations about exit in the last 30 days. And so it's a huge topic, and it's one that I think that this audience is really going to get some value out of. And so I'm going to just be quiet and give you opportunity to just introduce yourself, talk a little bit about the book and some of the other things that you do, and maybe just give the audience an opportunity to practically understand what you do to help people.
Super. Well, thank you so much, Kurt. I'm super excited to be here as well. And I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I'm excited that you've had so many conversations with business owners. And I think it's because baby boomers now are getting into their mid to late 70s. And this is becoming a very serious concern for them. If they're not going to sell their business to a third party, they've got to figure out, who their successor is going to be. So a little bit of background on me. My company is called Leadership and Legacy Group, and I've been doing this work for a long time. I work primarily on the non-financial aspects of succession planning and exit. So my focus areas are to work with business owners to help them navigate through some of the challenges that come with a succession planning process, develop their successors, help them choose their successor sometimes, but also help them develop their successors so that they're prepared to take over and run the company, not just today, but in the future. And then I also do a lot of work with business owners and executives who want to build a meaningful and rewarding next chapter. There's a lot of identity that is created in our business. And when that business is no longer such an important or significant part of our lives, it can be really difficult to figure out how you're going to replace that and still have meaning and relevance is the word that I hear most often. Along those lines, I do a fair amount of strategic planning facilitation, sometimes in the context of working with a business owner in succession and exit, but also sometimes kind of as a one-off sort of thing. And as you alluded to, I did write, this is my latest book, An Insider's Guide to Succession and Exit. And I'm excited. It came out almost a year ago now, and it's done really well. It made Amazon #1 new release. It made Amazon bestseller top 5. It's gotten, a lot of opportunity for me to do some speaking engagements around the country. So thank you for having me.
Sure, as it should. It is a great read. And I will tell you, I think I've come from a background of entrepreneurialism, multi-company owner and so on and so forth. And I will tell you that most of my exits were, let's just say, planned sales, and I'll just leave it at that. They weren't, I didn't really have a whole lot of succession thought processes in them, but I will just say this, that I never really considered the topic really in depth. And your book has helped me really get a good big picture view of what are the things to consider. The 10 principles they're just perfect. So, but thank you for your introduction and just talking a little bit about your experience. I want to read a few statistics that I think are very interesting. They come from the Exit Planning Institute, and I know that you're familiar with this report, but for the audience, the Exit Planning Institute is an organization that does certifications for what they call CEPA, or Certified Exit Planning Advisors. And the CEPA designation is one that really is an indication that the holder of the designation really understands exiting and understands how to coordinate resources to help the process of exiting a business work. There are some things that we're going to talk about that can't get involved, aren't involved in this process. And this is where you come in. And I think it's one of the most important pieces that we'll talk about today. Here's a statistic: 75% of business owners, this comes from the 2023 National State of Owner Readiness. It's a national report that SEPA has done. It's really, really well written. It's fantastic. If you get your hands on it, it would be a great thing for you, for sure. 75% of business owners would like to exit their business in the next 10 years. Right? How about this one? 69% of business owners identified exit strategy on their priority list. But this is the statistic I think was the most interesting to me. Only 9% of business owners, listen to this, this is kind of a double negative, have no plans at all for their exit. Only 9% have no plans. So it tells me it's a big topic, right? And as I said, SEPA is about process. That's what it's about. You get the right resources involved, and then you organize them in a process and steps and so on and so forth. You get through the door. But there is an element that you and I have talked about on numbers of occasions, and you mentioned it in this word identity. You mentioned it in business owners having their identity wrapped up in the business. And how do we disconnect from identity? And just so I can quote your book as well, on page 47, I'll just say 33% of business owners find it hard to emotionally let go. What about that topic?
Yeah, so I think it's a fascinating topic because, for most business owners that are looking at succession or an exit, because it's really letting go in either case. For most business owners, this has been a significant part of their life. And having invested so much to found the business in many cases, or if it's a second, third generation transition, they have all of the expectation about continuing the family business or if they purchased a business. And then there comes a point in their life where they've got to transition out. I mean, death will do that to you. But many owners are not going to wait that long, but it's very difficult. There's an emotional attachment that we have to our business. I mean, I can speak for myself. I have an emotional attachment. Our identity is wrapped up in it because it's been such a significant part of who we are. And so it can be really difficult. And that's why this process of transition is so hard. And one of the first principle in my book is transitions are messy. And part of the reason they're messy is because there's so much emotion tied to it. I mean, Kurt, you said that you've sold your businesses before. I'm sure that you had some emotion wrapped up in that because of the identity and also just because of the loss associated with this part of your life that is now being sold to somebody else.
Yeah, that's a great point. And frankly, I'll harken back to a business that I had, a real estate business. And it was epically emotionally challenging for me when I sold that business. It was epically challenging. So yeah, I totally agree with this. I think, the thing that I think is this is probably, and the reason that I really wanted us to start here is because this is in the practical idea of business owners and business owners in terms of our series. This is the most forgotten thing about it, right? And I know that you've had coaching and leadership counseling sessions with folks who didn't even know this was a problem until they got to it.
Yeah, and I can give a great example of this. This example is also in the book, and it's one that just sort of, smacked me in the face. I had a client that I was working with who initially hired me because he said, I have 2 key employees plus my son in the company, and they've been loyal and they've been a critical part of building the business to where it is today. And for the last 10 years, I have been telling them that when I'm ready to exit, I want them to take over. So he hired me to help develop them and help them transition to become the next leaders of the organization as he ramped down his activity in the company and his leadership role. And about 6 months in, it was very clear that when he had initially planned for those 3 folks to take over, the company was much, much smaller. But the rate of growth had been so high that they were not going to be in a position to be able to run the company at the growth rate that it was at anytime soon. And he had a timeline. I'm not sure if they would have ever been able to get there, but certainly not on the timeline that he had. So then we went down the path of looking for an owner that would just be a person that would buy the company. And ultimately what ended up happening was he couldn't find anybody that could put the resources together to pay him both what the company was worth, but also have the cash on hand to be able to navigate some of the financial needs that he had. And so the third option, which we eventually got to, was going with a private equity sale. And he had found a fantastic through resources, an investment banker. He had found a fantastic private equity firm, good culture, good fit with the industry, all that kind of stuff. They had gone through the grueling part of due diligence that anyone that's gone through this knows that it can be really difficult. So he had made it all the way through that. So now this is an 18-month process we've been working together. And part of my role through the later stages of the process was to provide some grounding for him and be able to remind him of what was important to him and the outcomes that he wanted to go after. Well, one day he came into my office and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. And I had him sit down and asked him, what's going on? And what happened was there was some issue in the discussion he had with the private equity firm. And he just basically said to me, I'm going to call the deal off. And he was at the finish line. I mean, he was literally a week away from the closing. Everything was done and it looked really good. He was getting a good value for the company. He liked the private equity firm. He felt like the role that they wanted him to play was a role he would enjoy. All this stuff was in place. But what happened was there was so much emotion going through this process that he just said, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it anymore. And so we spent 90 minutes together, and my job was not to convince him to do it. My job was to help him remember why he got into this in the first place and what really mattered most to him. At the end of the 90 minutes, he looked back at me and he said, you're so right. You are so right. This is the right deal for me. I do want to do this. I want to do this, and he left my office. He signed, the paperwork a week later, and he called me up and he said, thank you so much. He might have pulled the plug if he didn't have, because the emotions were swirling, and we can make decisions that aren't necessarily the right ones for us when they're swirling and we don't have a way of getting grounded again.
Yeah. An old adage that I learned, and I don't know where I learned it, but I learned it the hard way. Never make permanent decisions in temporary situations, right? And so
brilliant.
That is just a great testimony to the effect of emotion on the exit event, right?
Yeah.
Conversely, one of the things that I did want to get out and for the audience is what in your experience and your writing and the things that you've learned in what makes a succession. I say, how do you exit well? But I don't know whether that's the right nomenclature. What makes it good, right?
Yeah, it's I love that you identified that distinction, because you could say what's a good exit, or you could look at what does success look like for the business, which is very important. What does success look like for the owner? And then in our situation, we're talking about succession. And so what does success look like for the successor? And then, the key employees and the customers. I mean, you can look at all of those aspects. For me, I kind of boil it down to a couple of themes, and it all revolves around readiness. So successor readiness is important. Owner readiness is important. And, in my mind, owner readiness has a couple of critical components. Owner readiness includes an owner being clear on what matters most to them, because many owners, fortunately, are in a position where they may not need the proceeds from the succession or sale of the business, because they should be selling it to somebody. They may not need those to live the lifestyle that they have been living, or to enhance their lifestyle, maybe with more travel or something like that. But they want to get a fair deal for the business that they've built. They also need to know that there is a successor that is capable of taking over and running the company, not just for today, but also being able to lead it into the future and adapt and adjust to the changing environment and technology and customer needs and all that kind of stuff. Owner readiness also has to do with, do they have clarity on what their role is going to be, if there's going to be a role at all for them once they make the transition to the successor? Because if they have clarity on that, it can ease their confidence, because they'll still be around, but also it will ease the emotional identity piece, because they'll still have a influence in a piece of the business. And then last is that whole emotional readiness. And so I think owner readiness is a critical piece of defining success. And then I think successor readiness. And from a successor readiness perspective, it's really looking at, is the successor feeling confident, and are they capable of being able to take over? Are they excited about leading the company? Do they have a clear vision? And are they ready to fill the role of the next CEO?
Well, you know what I would ask you here, because this is an important point, right? Folks listening who may be considering this, may be asking the next logical question is, okay, Abby, talk a little bit about how you as a coach, an advisor, would sit with somebody and help them think about what are the things that I need to do to be ready, right? What does that really look like? And, it doesn't have to be chapter and verse, but at least kind of a framework for the way you would engage and help them, identify gaps, things associated with that process.
Yeah, I think one of the most important early pieces of this work that I would encourage any owner to do is to, whether they're selling to a third party or a successor, I think it's important that they figure out what really matters most to them. In the conversations that I have, and I know you're part of a financial planning firm, very well respected financial planning firm, the money is often what we talk about the most. We may not talk about how much money we're getting for our deal, but we often talk about the money as a critical piece of it. And I'm not in any way trying to undervalue the financial aspects of it. It is important. But what I find is that that's not typically the most important piece in a succession. The most important piece that business owners talk to me about are things like, I want to make sure that my successor is ready, like we talked about before. I want to make sure that my employees are taken care of. I want to make sure that the culture that I have worked so hard to build over the lifetime of, my ownership of this business is maintained. It'll never be maintained exactly that way, but that the core components and values that I hold dear are maintained. In fact, I found an interesting statistic. Let me see if I can find it for you real quick. They say, 54% of owners are worried that their successor won't treat employees well. So that tells you it's a pretty big concern area. So figuring out what matters most, I think, is a very important early on piece. Secondly, I think it's important to figure out what needs to transition to that successor, because the role that an owner is playing in the company, that CEO, the way that the CEO role or president role is defined today, may look different when a successor takes it over. It may be a different skill set that they bring, and you want to capitalize on some of the strengths that they have that the owner doesn't have. It may be that they don't have some strengths that still need to be executed at a leadership level, but they're not the right person to do it. So figuring out how those role components are going to get allocated. And then third, developing the successor or the successor, the team around the successor in a way that's going to ensure that that continued growth and profitability will be there. And then a lot of work around, I certainly do some exit, strategy kind of stuff, helping the owner figure out what's next. But an underlying piece of all of that is there is going to be stress in this transition. I can't predict exactly what stress it's going to be. Every situation is a little bit different, but there's going to be stress. And so a lot of what I do, people refer to me quite often as, in fact, I had a meeting yesterday with somebody, and the CEO of the company, she looked at me and she said, "Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm in a therapy session." And I laughed and I said, I hear that a lot, because it's cathartic to talk through this stuff. And then, so I often will have some guidance and advice on, or recommendations on what to do based on, my experience and their particular situation. And my role in all of that is really to listen and hear what's going on, and then provide some guidance or direction to help them through it. And also validate a lot of times. I mean, people wonder all the time, am I normal? And I haven't met many people going through this that aren't normal. So every emotion that they're experiencing and every challenge that they're facing, for better or worse, is pretty normal.
Yeah.
They just don't know.
Right. And I think that's a great point. I think, one of the things that you do very well, and I think anyone who's listening that might be thinking about this, is you are really good at setting expectations. And that is such a help up front, right? I mean, if someone is sitting still, you can look somebody in the face that says, "Oh, I want to sell my company." This is going to be an emotional roller coaster for you. Well, I hadn't really thought about that, right? Again, you're very good at doing that. And so, kind of my next question is, we talk about kind of that framework of preparation, but we started with the good. Let's talk a little bit about the bad, right? I'll just say the bad, right? Because it is bad. So talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've seen, and not the gory story, but kind of what's the lesson learned kind of story in some of the stuff that you've seen that was not good.
Yeah, so I want to kick that off. It's a great question. I want to kick that off with a statistic from the Family Business Institute that I found. It's also in the book. 74% of senior generation leaders report that there is a clearly communicated succession plan. 78% of their successors report that there isn't. And so I think that really illustrates one of the most significant challenges is that owners are thinking about this from time to time. And, you're probably familiar with the rolling 10, which is something that Patrick Ungashik, who wrote Dance in the End Zone, coined that phrase. And it's the idea that the planning process and the exit is always 5 to 10 years away. Right. And so the challenge is getting started and figuring out what is the process, because part of the reason I wrote the book is because people ask me all the time, like, I don't even know how to get started. And the financial stuff they can get help with because that's pretty clear, but how do I get started with the succession and the rest of it? So I think figuring out, how to get started and communicating that and being able to have a dialogue with it. It's typically not most effective to have a top-down kind of a thing. Here's what we want to do and here's how we're going to do it. But really creating a communication process and a flow to make that happen. And, owners are not necessarily expecting or consciously realizing that they still need to lead the business, of course, but they also have to lead this transition because the successor can't lead it. They may try, they may want to, and they may make some headway on it, but they can't because the buck always stops with the owner. They have complete control. And so part of the work that I get involved in is, helping the owner recognize that, yes, you do have complete control, but if you hold on too tight to everything that you think is important, you may not have a successor when all is said and done. And I've had examples. I can give you lots of examples where, as I've been working with clients, successors have come into my office and said, I'll give you a great example. I have a client that I've been working with now for about 2 years. And the owner of the company, the majority owner of the company and the father of the successor, he contacted me and he just really didn't want to start this process. But he knew he had to because he was 72 years old and he wasn't getting any younger. And it's a pretty brutal business. Well, we got about 6 months in and the father wasn't doing the important work that he needed to do to make this transition, to get this transition underway. And the successor called me up and he said, I can't do this anymore. For 3 or 4 years before we hired you, we've been going through this process and I can't do it again. And I'm going to give my father my notice that I'm leaving. And I said, whoa, wait, before you jump to that, let's talk through it. And we ended up talking through it and we identified what mattered most to the successor and what he needed to see in order to feel like there was progress. Because in the conversation I had with him, he said, more than anything, I want to run this company. I've been working here for 20 years. I want to be the successor, but I can't take this process. And so we sat down with the owner, his father, and we talked through and identified what are the things that were very reasonable for him to expect. And his mom ended up getting involved in the process, which she's not in the business, but it was an important conversation to have. And the father and mother agreed that we needed to work on those things and we needed to move them forward. And now he's in a position where he's essentially, a year later or so, he's essentially running the company. He's happy as can be. And his father is supporting that transition. So it could have gone really ugly.
Yeah. So I heard loud and clear communication.
Yep.
Good deal.
One of the things.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to, put this sort of in your court for a little while. One of the things that I think is important is thinking through how the financials will work. And where I get involved in that sometimes is helping an owner think through how they want to make a transition to a successor, especially if they have other family members that are not in the business because they want their estate plan and their transition plan to take care of all of their children fairly, maybe not necessarily equally. And so I wonder if you could comment on that, especially from the perspective of, I think a lot of owners, it's important that they recognize that if they're financing the sale of the company to a successor who probably won't have a big bucket of money out there waiting for them, that they're financing that sale with their money.
Correct.
So, would you speak to that? Because that's really much more in your world.
Yeah, that's a great point. And frankly, we look at when we look at a company and an owner, talk to an owner that's interested in exiting the business, we have a discipline around three things. One of those being a wealth gap. What does a wealth gap look like? A wealth gap can be I don't have enough money, or a wealth gap could be I've got all my money in the business, back to your point about financing it to a successor. Or a wealth gap can be the lifestyle that I anticipate having because this has been a business that has helped me flourish in my current lifestyle is not something that is going to be generated by the sale of the business. So we start with those kinds of conversations. But I think your point is a better point, and that is that many business owners don't start by considering the real big picture between the connection of personal wealth and retirement and the business itself. And I think we start helping them get a grip on that. Then we step back and do some metrics on the business, whether that's a profit elements, profit gaps, value gaps, and where is the business going. And so to your point precisely, we try to start by making the connection to the unavoidable connection of personal wealth and the business wealth. Lots of times business owners will say, yeah, I get that. I've got a good retirement plan. But the majority of times it's crickets. It's well, I know I've got to think that way. And I think you've experienced this too. All of a person's wealth is tied up in the business, right? And so we navigate those, and we've done yeoman's work in a couple of areas to really help. And I will bring back an anecdotal story. You mentioned the successors and having the successors, own the equity. I had a conversation with a client, and very successful business, really kind of taken off in the last 2 or 3 years. She's done a great job with the company. She has 4 people in that company. And in the first conversation that I had with her comment to me was, Kurt, I've got to make sure that these people are taken care of. I don't care how I do that. And I said, well, are you prepared to sell equity at a discount to make sure that you take care of them in the long run? What does that mean? And I'll end right there. What does that mean? Okay, so it started the conversation. So yes, it's definitely a thing. It's definitely and it's definitely something that we focus on. So.
One of the other challenges I was going to mention that I think pops up quite often in this process is that owners can do a really nice job of figuring out what their successor needs to do, and I'm often helping them build a more efficient and effective development plan for their successor so that they gain the experience and the skills to be able to demonstrate to the owner that they really are ready, because the decision on readiness is not going to be the successor saying, I'm ready. Yeah. It's really going to be the owner saying, I think you're ready, and the successor agreeing with that. And when those two things line up, that's really the perfect outcome. But what I find sometimes is that the owner will lay out a set of expectations to their successor. And then the successor, in most cases, is eager to prove themselves. And so they will work really hard to embrace and learn what they need to learn and demonstrate to the owner that they're ready. And each time they demonstrate another component of that new role, they feel like they're getting closer and closer to that moment when the owner will say, I think you're ready, and I'm going to transition, either ramp down or transition out. But what I find sometimes is that because of the emotional aspect of this, the goal line moves. The owner will move the goal line and then move it again and move it again. And, a couple of months ago, I was going through this process. I had been working with this company for about 5 years, which is, it's not typical. But in this case, it's a larger company and they were going through multiple iterations. So we were getting close to the first transition. And the successor came into my office and said, every single time I think I'm ready, the goal line moves, and it moves again and again and again. And I just don't believe that he's ever going to turn the company over to me. He's never going to trust me enough. And it begins to feel like it's a trust issue. But in most cases, it is not a trust issue. The owner trusts, not in all cases, of course, sometimes there's reason for that, but in a lot of cases, it's not about trust. It's really about the owner's emotional preparedness to release the control that they've had. And so, I'm often working with the owners to try to ease that. And if that doesn't happen, then there can be a lot of really uncomfortable dynamics all the way up into and including a failed exit.
Sure. Sure. And that's a great point. I've seen that. I have seen that in my career, and it is a real thing. And frankly, it's one of the reasons that you're very good at what you do, because you're able to sense these things going on, not necessarily right up in your face, but you, because of your relationships, understand what those dynamics feel like. And that is just a wildly important thing. So listen, we're coming close to the end, and I want to give you an opportunity to, I like this, your top 3, your top 5, your top 2, your top 6, whatever it is, 18. No, it can't be 18. But anyway, your top list of recommendations for someone listening who is really, this has piqued their interest. They need to make some decisions. How about the Abby list of these are the things that I recommend, right now?
Yeah, so thank you. I'd love to share a couple of those. One is, I think owners need to think about what's most important to them, because if they can get really grounded in that, then I think that will be a good stability point to return to when things get a little, tricky or messy. Second, I think figuring out and being able to map out what your successor needs to be able to do. And in my book, I came up with not an acronym, but kind of an easy to remember, I think it's easy to remember, methodology that I would encourage owners to think about when they're looking at their successor. What do you need them to know? So the technical knowledge or the industry knowledge, something like that, what do you need them to be able to show? So those are behaviors that you want them to demonstrate, things like that. What do you need them to be able to do? So accomplish, what skills do they need to be able to demonstrate? And then, so know, show, do, and deliver. And so in many cases, I think it's critically important that they deliver some results along this development process. And the second component of that is recognizing that people learn best not by shadowing, they learn best by having experiences doing the work. Intentional development is key in my mind. And there's good literature out there, I think, certainly in the book, on how to build intentional experiences. And then the third piece, which I think can be a process of emotionally navigating through this, is to begin to think about what role they want as the business transitions to the successor. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. It's not an in or I'm out, but it is really critical that they define what that role will be and what the parameters are. And if they want to roll at all, and then how are they going to supplement their, I call it a portfolio life. What will be the other components in that portfolio that will keep them feeling relevant and have a meaningful and rewarding next chapter? So I think those are some kind of broad brush things that I would recommend. What would you recommend?
So, I think we started with the whole emotional reality. I think that whole emotional reality piece is much larger than, the normal business owner gives it credit for. But, the thing that I do is and the things that I work on are typically a little bit more practical in terms of their impact on what I'd call it business acumen impact, right? I mean, at the end of the day. And what I find when I get involved in one of these cases is business owners who think that their business is perfectly well oiled and organized for a transition, for an exit, classically don't like the news when you sit still with them and say, well, maybe we should be considering, ... And so that has been my experience. And I think when you add those kinds of conversations on top of the emotional piece, then you really start to create a opportunity, is the way I'll characterize it, So that's been my experience. But listen, I could have this conversation for a while, and I'm sure our audience could too. So thank you very much, Abby. It's been fantastic. Let me remind everybody, Amazon, you're going to get some links that are going to come in the email that you're getting, and the podcast links will be there. The book links in the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank Thank you, Kurt.
Really have appreciated this, and I know that our audience is going to get great value. We'll also put your contact information in the information, so anyone who wants to get a hold of you, I highly encourage it. And once again, I want to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. I knew it was going to be fun, and it exceeded my highest expectations, so I appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. We are so appreciative of your time, and hopefully this was, in fact, practical for you. We look forward to seeing you again on another Business Owner or Practical Ideas Series podcast. Have a great day.